Welcome. As you can see, today we're going to talk about Reconstruction. The Civil War has shattered the nation. The nation has been split north and south. It has been torn asunder. And so, as the war is ending, people are asking, what now? Because they're looking around and the nation has paid a very high cost. We must remember there are nearly 700,000 young men on both sides who died. An entire generation of men gone. And in fact, a lot of the South lay in ruins. Not only were lives destroyed, but cities were destroyed throughout the South. Here you can see Richmond, Virginia. And then here's Atlanta, Georgia. Remember Sherman's March to the Sea. Dead horse, Confederate soldier. So the South has been largely not destroyed, but a lot of it has been destroyed. A lot of it lays in ruins. A lot of its infrastructure, its economy is in a shambles. The crops are untended or burned down. Remember, Sherman marched through and burned all kinds of stuff, but now they don't have in the South slaves to work the land. So there's an uncertain future. Now, the blame is laid at the doorstep of the South. They are the ones who had threatened the Union. And so a lot of people are going to wonder at this time, how will the South come back to us? How will they come back to the Union, the nation, the United States? Will they be invited back? Are they going to be occupied militarily until they're pacified, until everything's peaceful? So there's that question about the South coming back in, the southern states. But there's a huge question here also, and that is what to do, in a sense, as they would put it, with what they would call the Negro problem. What to do with the 4 million newly freed people, formerly slaves. Are they going to be included? Are they going to be, they're freed, right? Presumably, so far. Are they going to be sent to Africa? Are they going to stay here? Are they going to be given some land out west? Are they going to be considered equal? Are they going to live amongst us? These are the concerns, and these were their concerns at the time, and the concerns of many, really. Now, the Civil War offers the chance of not just reconstructing the nation, but reinventing the nation. Remember, ideas of freedom and equality have been hotly debated for some time, and they're going to become even hotter toward the end of the war. And a lot of people look with trepidation. They're fearful. Most Southern whites and many Northern whites as well, they don't like what might be in store for them. Even those people who were glad to see slavery end did not want, a lot of these people don't want to live amongst black folk. They detest, they abhor ideas of inclusion, equality. So all of these questions are on people's minds as they're looking to see what the government's going to do, looking to what Lincoln is going to do. Now, as this of course is a question during the war, and it's a more pertinent question. It is a hotter question, more sort of overt question as the war is ending. So people are looking to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's vision for the nation and how he's going to answer these questions about the South being included in about what to do, quote unquote, about the Negro problem. All of these were questions that in his mind sort of morphed and changed over time. His vision changes. We know that in the first couple of years of the war, Lincoln is openly committed only to saving the Union. Now, in private, other things are going on, but in the open, he's saying, all I want to do is save the Union. But at the same time, it is clear that he is working, even during the war, on the slavery issue, emancipation, right? The Emancipation Proclamation, but he's also working on colonization. In fact, what you're starting to see is Congress passing laws and Lincoln signing them to work on ideas of freedom, but also ideas of colonization to Africa. I'll give you an example. Toward the end of the war, Washington, D.C. Has slavery outlawed. Congress outlaws slavery altogether in Washington, D.C. Remember, the Compromise of 1850 had ended only the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but now slavery is over. At the same time, they're trying to free slaves by saying to slaveholders, and Congress actually offers this, they say, hey, slaveholders, if you free for every slave you free, you will get $300. And then once this person is free, what we will do is offer them a trip to Haiti or Liberia. So slaves who agree to leave the United States, former slaves, black people generally, any black person who decide they want to go to Haiti or Liberia, they will get $100. So notice something. On the one hand, yes, he's working on freedom, but on the other hand, he's really working on colonization, meaning free these people and get them the heck out of here. Now, you have to remember, Lincoln is trying to maneuver these very sort of hotly contested political waters. So his measures are, what some people might call half-hearted, but you have to look at it from a political standpoint as well, that he cannot move too fast, too hard, right? Now, his emancipation and colonization policy does, and with this reimbursement, $300 per slave, $100 per person who wants to leave. A few thousand slaves are actually freed this way toward the end of the war. A few hundred of them actually take the $100 and leave the country. Now, this, of course, is happening really in the in I mean, it's happening, but it's not by and large how the slaves will be freed, right? Because, in fact, toward the end of the war, a lot of the border states don't like Lincoln's policies. The southern states don't like this policy of freedom, right? I mean, for them, slavery is the end all and be all of their economy. Toward the end of the war, southern states, because they see what's happening, right, with Washington, D.C. going free and the federal government paying to free slaves and then paying to send black people out, what the southerners begin, they're convinced of more and more as this is happening toward the end of the war, is that the war is about taking their slaves away. In fact, Congress also during the war ends slavery in the territories. Remember the Mexican cession, all those territories taken from Mexico, the territory of Nebraska. Well, Congress, because the southern states have left, right? So Congress is now controlled by Northerners. So Northerners, along with Northern congressmen, along with Lincoln, are going to end slavery in these territories. This, of course, is the issue that shattered the nation. And when they do this, of course, Southerners more and more believe that the war is really about taking their slaves away. Now, Lincoln has to walk a fine line. Toward the end of the war, he has privately come to believe that all people should be free wherever they are. Now, he can't push too hard on this issue publicly, but we know that he does announce the Emancipation Proclamation. What's interesting is that he, even before he announces the Emancipation Proclamation, by the way, other military leaders working beneath him as commander-in-chief, he's commander-in-chief, other military leaders had done something similar, had issued Emancipation Proclamation orders in those territories that were in rebellion. But he vetoed those. He knocked those down. He said, no, you don't do that. Because he wanted, it's not that he wanted to control the issue, but this issue needed to be controlled. because you remember you still have the border states to worry about toward the end of the war. Are they going to stay? Are they going to leave? An example of this is during the war, toward the end of the war, one of his military commanders had implemented martial law in the state of Missouri, which basically means military rule in the state of Missouri. Remember, Missouri was a border state, one of these states that held slaves, but which had remained loyal to the Union, but which may just jump to the other side if pushed too far. They're teetering on the fence, so to speak. So when the commander implements martial law, he also frees all the slaves in Missouri. And Lincoln's like, whoa, 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 that's a little too far. He does not want to lose Missouri. He doesn't want to lose the other border states. He doesn't want to anger people within the Union. So he vetoes all this stuff. But interestingly enough, later on, of course, he does it himself. So what's the point here? It's that he's walking this fine line. He has to have a very nuanced approach, not a heavy-handed approach. He cannot hit people over the head by ending slavery. Arguably, he couldn't do it on his own anyway, because he would need Congress on his side. Now, we know that by 1865, it is clear that the North will win. By this time, the war has taken an effect, like it had really taken a toll on Lincoln. If you look at these pictures before on the left and after the war, the man looks haggard. Now, some historians posit, they assert, they guess that he had some sort of condition, some sort of health condition, sort of an immunological condition that really ages you quickly. My wife has an immunological condition, and I'll tell you, and she knows I talk about this. But sometimes she looks 20 years younger, and sometimes when she has a bad day because of her immunological condition, she looks like Lincoln there, basically. I mean, it's just that different. It can happen, and then she'll wake up 2 days later and she's back again. It's just really, really strange. And so some historians say, well, it wasn't just the war that did this to him. But the presidency does, of course, age you. It is an immense responsibility, or at least we we expect that the person in the office will take it as an immense responsibility. Anyway, so the war has taken a toll on Lincoln, and the future of what the world, what the nation will look like after the war, all that's hotly debated. It's a topic of great fear and animosity, as we know. Lincoln, at the end of the war, is planning to allow the rebel states back into the Union without punishment. He does not want to punish them. It's almost like the prodigal son, right? We're going to welcome you back in. But a little bit more than that, because he's like, look, you left. In order to come back, you have to do a few things. So it's not like I'm welcoming you back like all is good. You have to swear an oath of allegiance to the Union. You left, you messed up, you forswore us. You have to swear to us in order to get back in. And of course, this is going to anger a lot of people. He also tells the South, free all your slaves. In order to come back in, you have to free the slaves, officially. Lincoln already, by the end of the war, is committed to a new nation without slavery. Now, we know he didn't start that way. He just first wanted to save the Union, but over time, he has combined his desire for saving the Union with his desire to end slavery, as we've said several times. Lincoln, during the war, wasn't only having to deal with the states. He was also having to deal with the issue of a lot of poor Black people in the South. The people that need to be helped only because they had been enslaved for so long. So as the war is ending, he actually sets up a federal aid program to help them. It's called the Freedmen's Bureau. This is probably the very first federal social welfare program. I'm going to say it's the first federal social welfare program in our history. It is designed to offer medical care, schooling, food to the freed people of the South. Now, what's interesting is that it also helps poor white people. One of the things that's often lost on a lot of Southerners today is the fact that the Freedmen's Bureau fed a lot of their ancestors, gave them free food, medical care, education. But when we think of Freedmen's Bureau, we only think of black people, those of us who think of it at all, I suppose, right? Um, and so Lincoln sets this up because he wants to help the black people and the South generally come back in. But he's also intent on bringing the Southern states back into the Union without punishing them too harshly. He mostly just wants them to end slavery. He doesn't want to push things too far too soon. He does want them to recognize federal power over the states because they're the ones who left. And he wants them, the Southerners, to ratify the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment has already been passed by Congress by the end of the war, but it has to be ratified by the states. Ratification means that people in each state will come and vote on the amendment. So, this is for government class, but just so you know, in order for an amendment to be added to the Constitution, it first has to pass both houses of Congress, and then it has to be sent to the states for approval, ratification, right? So there's a two-part process there, and so the states have to ratify. So he says, if you want to come back in, not only do you recognize federal power that we have over you as the federal government, but you have to recognize that you have no power over people to enslave them. So swear allegiance to the United States and swear off slavery. At the same time, he's talking about taking slaveholders' land, giving it to the newly freed folk, distributing it land to them. You may have heard this whole thing, 40 acres and a mule. Already there were Union officers, generals who were telling slaves, we're going to distribute this land and we're going to give it to you. And some of them were doing that. And so Lincoln talks about continuing that, distributing land. And so 40 acres and a mule was the thinking among a lot of newly freed black folk. We're going to get 40 acres to actually work and a mule to work it with. So he's talking about taking land from the slaveholders and distributing land to the people, the freed people. He's also talking about allowing voting rights. Now, he's still not very combative about it. Remember, he still has to walk this line. So that's kind of his vision, right? But his vision of Reconstruction is going to be ended by an assassin's bullet. We know that a week after Lee surrenders to Grant, Lincoln is dead. We know that John Wilkes Booth, who is in fact part of a larger plot, he wasn't acting alone. He had several comrades there in arms, and they had actually planned to actually decapitate the government by killing his cabinet members as well. One of them gets stabbed in the neck. I can't remember his name. I think he got stabbed in the neck. But anyway, the point is, it wasn't just Lincoln they were after. They were looking to decapitate the government. John Wilkes Booth, this guy was a Southerner. He hated Lincoln. He hated him, and he was a devout believer in the cause of the South. Interestingly, he was an actor at the time. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you may take a tour of Ford's Theater, which is where this happens, right? Lincoln is sitting there at Ford's Theater watching a play. I think it's called My American Cousin, whatever. He's watching this play, and that's when John Wilkes Booth sneaks up on him. Well, that whole area now is a museum. They have, there has this little house across the street from the museum, or from that theater, that now is a little museum too, and they show you where Lincoln was laid down after he was shot. He was taken to that little house across the street, put in the bed, and so forth. But John Wilkes Booth was actually an actor at the time, and so he was fairly well known. So I don't know who to compare him to in terms of actors today, but he was fairly well known and considered, this handsome, good-looking guy. But he was this rabid racist, and he hated Lincoln. So John Wilkes Booth goes to the Ford Theater, caps Lincoln in the back of the head. He jumps from the balcony, because Lincoln is in that balcony, and as he's jumping from the balcony, he yells out, "Sic semper tyrannis." Thus, always to titans. This is what you, to tyrants. Thus, always to tyrants. This is what you do to tyrants. He considered Lincoln a tyrant because Lincoln didn't allow the South to do what it had wanted to do all along. And we know what that is. He breaks his leg, right? John Wilkes Booth famously breaks his leg when, or fractures, I don't remember, but he hurts his leg really bad. He's like limping around. He flees. He eventually is treated by a doctor who also, in fact, will get caught up in this, and he'll get arrested as part of the plot, and he'll serve some prison time. He'll be put in a federal prison for a while, and then and maybe that was unfair. He's a doctor. He's supposed to help people who are in front of him. Because he helped this guy, he gets put in jail. But this doctor will be released later on because of good behavior and so forth. Because while he's in the federal prison, he actually administers treatment to not just the prisoners, but of course to people who need it, around them, the prison guards and so forth. But anyway, that's just a little aside. John Wilkes Booth breaks his leg. He eventually gets captured. Now, we know, I think, that how the presidential succession works, right? President dies, vice president stands up and becomes the president. And here we have Lincoln on the left, and on the right we have a guy named Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was chosen to run as vice president by Lincoln. Now, this guy was a typical white Southerner of the time. He was a Southerner. He's a vehement, rabid racist. He's a states' rights guy. But he had been brought onto the ticket to appease the South because he was this kind of guy. At the same time, he's also a Union guy. He did not like the fact that the South left. So he's a strong Union guy, but he's racist like hell. And he's a states' rights guy to a degree, not to the point of secession. When he becomes president, he starts pardoning the Southern rebels. He's going to take a whole different approach than what we think Lincoln would have taken. So he starts pardoning rebels. So they're not going to have to, they're not going to be branded traitors. They're not going to be executed, none of that. He does want Southern states, though, to do a few things. He says, you must swear loyalty to the Union, to the United States. There is no Union. It's the United States. Swear loyalty to the country. Swear off secession, meaning say you were wronged by leaving. The Union, the United States, is indissoluble. So swear it off. Swear off secession. Also, he wants them to ratify the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, remember, is going to end slavery. The 13th Amendment is actually going to be ratified in 1865 and added to the Constitution. And again, Johnson supports this. So, he says, end slavery, swear off secession. But he's going to pretty much think this is enough for the South to do. We'll get back to that point. But the 13th Amendment is ratified, it's added to the Constitution, and it generally prohibits slavery. Notice this is the heart of the issue of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment is the only place in the U.S. Constitution that governs behavior between you and me, between individuals in the country. Usually, the Constitution, well, in every other respect, except this one, the Constitution actually prohibits what is called state action, which means government action. If the federal government acts against you, right, then it can be restrained by the Constitution. But the 13th Amendment is the only place where we actually are prohibited from acting against each other as people. And it makes sense, right? You shouldn't be able to enslave other people. Still, Johnson, even though he wants them to swear off secession and ratify the 13th Amendment, he's pretty well accommodating to the South. He actually works to bring Southern members of Congress back to Congress, right? Remember, when the states left, they built their own Congress over there. But now that the Southern states are recognized as still being part of this union, they need representation in Congress. And so he's working to reseat those members from the South. For a while, they had been kept out, even after the war ended, for a moment, because Lincoln wasn't sure how to bring them back in. But he works to reseat them. He's also ignoring the black codes. By the way, just so you know, black codes exist at this time in the North and the South, but they especially are more prevalent in the South and are in fact enforced more so in the South than they are even in the North. So there is a difference, but I do want you to know that in the North, there were black codes. What were these black codes? They're basically passed to control the lives of the newly freed people. States are starting to pass these. They want to deny freed black people all kinds of things. They want to deny them political rights, right? So generally what you see throughout the South is, these are just examples, there's a bunch more, but you cannot sit on a jury if you're black. You can't testify in court if you're black. Of course, they don't want them voting either. So they resist voting as well among black people. That's going to change because of the pressure from the North, from the Union. Point is, denying them political rights, also keeping them from carrying guns, keeping them from serving in state militias. The idea of a black man with a gun is way too scary for them, as it is probably for lots of people even today, if we're being honest. It's funny, until I came to Texas, I never thought I needed a gun. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I grew up in the hood, really, where I've had guns I had a gun to my head before, and it's not a great feeling. But the point is, where I grew up, it's like it's usually not going to end badly unless you really messed with somebody. So you kind of needed to kind of know how to maneuver things. Yeah, you might get robbed, but they're usually not trying to kill you. Just give them what they want and then move on. But it wasn't until I came down to Texas where I thought, man, maybe I need a gun. It seems like everybody down here has one. I'm not worried so much about the thug next door or the guy down the street, whatever. I'm worried more about people over here who have a lot of road rage. By the way, if they think you cut them off or you make a mistake, everybody makes mistakes. You might cut somebody off, they'll pull a gun on you. They'll shoot you on 20 over here, where I go, which I take to work regularly during the regular school year. But anyway, I guess I'm digressing. And here's the thing. All right, I think I was getting to this point. This idea of a black man carrying a gun. I mean, look what's happening lately with all these shootings. I mean, these things, of course, have been going on for some time. But I always tell people, I'm not going to be, even though I carry a gun out when I leave, I'm not going to be a good guy with a gun. I'm brown skinned. If I see something happening, right, I'm not going to try to pull out my gun and start shooting somebody to protect others, because if the cops arrive, and this should really apply to everyone, but I think as a brown man, this concerns me. The cops get there, they're gonna look at me and wonder right away. And fair enough, I got a gun, right? And so this really should apply to everyone. But I am particularly concerned. I always tell my wife, no, I'm not gonna be a hero. Something happens at Walmart, I'll protect myself and protect you and whatever. But I'm not trying to get out there to be a hero, unless it's clear that I can be. You know what I mean? I'm not going to put my life on the line for nothing. But anyway, that's a digression. I guess I didn't need to go into. But the thing about it is that these black codes are keeping black people in their place, so to speak, from the point of view of white people. So, can't carry guns, serve in a state militia, you can't have political rights. They're also dictating their way of life personally when it comes to work. Black people in the South, especially in the South, they have to be farmers or servants. If a black person wants to do anything other than be a farmer or a servant, then these black codes will place a special tax on you. So if you wanted to be a teacher as a black woman, if you wanted, or even black man, if you wanted to be someone who works with his hands, you have a skill, you're a saddle maker, you're a cake maker, whatever, then you have to pay a special tax to be that. So they're trying to keep people from rising. They also require all black people to actually have a job. You have to show that you have a job, documentation. You have to carry with you the fact that you somehow, right, a written notice or something, or you have to have your boss come in and swear for you if you get caught without your paperwork or whatever. You have to actually prove that you have a job. If not, you go to jail. If you are someone who works, if you're a black person who works under a contract, let's say I contract with you for you to build my fence, right? And I say, okay, I want you to build my fence and I'm going to pay you so much money. If you decide you don't want to finish the fence, then, or if you don't want to finish the fence, if you break the contract in any way, then you're going to go to jail. Now, of course, that doesn't happen today. Today, if you break a contract, you don't get jail time. You might have to pay money or restitution, some kind of money damages, right? Maybe. But you don't go to jail for breaking a contract. Here, they would go to jail for breaking a contract. You have to have documentation of a job. And here's the thing. Here's the kicker. Here's why this exists. The 13th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment is very important because it abolishes slavery, so to speak. If you read clearly, though, closely, I should say, you're going to see something. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction. Now, I skipped something, right? What did I skip? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist. What does this mean? No slavery unless the guy, the woman, whoever, is actually convicted of a crime. So what happens? After the 13th Amendment is passed and as Reconstruction moves on, Southern states are doing everything they can to put black men in jail. Because the 13th Amendment allows them to be put back to work. This is one of the reasons that Southerners agree to ratify it. So what you're going to see in the Reconstruction period is all sorts of black men being thrown in jail for petty offenses, for things that they didn't do, or for things that ordinarily people wouldn't be thrown in jail for. I mean, you're going to get thrown in jail for working without, for breaking a contract. You're going to be thrown in jail because you don't have a job. Come on. I mean, how many people would be in jail for that right now? It doesn't make any sense, right? So they're trying to preserve slavery. Slavery by another name is what people call it. Slavery by another name. Now, these black codes, which generally restrict the lives of black folk, also recognize some rights. Recognizes their marriage between black people, not between white people and black people, but it recognizes marriages between black people. It recognizes their right to own land. They recognize over time a trial by jury. You can't sit on a jury, right? But if you're going to be tried by a jury, if you're going to be tried in court, you will get a jury. And of course, that jury is going to be all white, as I said, because black people are not allowed to sit on it. So there are some rights: recognition of marriage between black folk, you can own land, you get a trial by jury. Now, Johnson supports all this. He's a typical white Southerner. All he wants is, the 13th Amendment to be ratified and swear off for secession and all that kind of stuff. When he starts talking to these people, he's very, very accommodating. But Johnson is going to be at odds with his own party. There's going to be a bunch of radical Republicans who will see their chance to transform the nation, to actually embody the principles of the Declaration of Independence. These men, these radical Republicans, as they're called, had been at odds with Lincoln too. They existed during the time of Lincoln, right? They wanted the South punished, but he didn't. They had told Lincoln, you need to push for recognition of citizenship for black men and the right to vote for black men and equality for everyone. So citizenship for black people, equality for black people, and the right to vote for black men is what they were pushing for. Now, now they're pushing Johnson. They might have gotten some of this from Lincoln, but they're not going to really get it from Johnson, at least not easily. They're pushing Johnson to actually be more inclusive of black folk and be more punishing of the southern states. And so they start passing laws for greater inclusion. Now, remember, they're the ones that are basically in charge. The Republican Party is in charge. The Northerners are in charge because Southerners are still pretty much on the outs, right? They have not yet been allowed back into the Union, and so they're able to pass. Congress is able to pass some laws. So the radical Republicans are able to pass an expansion of Freedom Bureau's powers. So they expand the powers of the Freedmen's Bureau. You remember the Freedmen's Bureau. Not only are they going to not only are they going to be involved in giving medical care and education and food, but now under the Freedmen's Bureau, the civil rights of black people are going to be monitored, protected. So he actually sets up the Congress, the radical Republicans, set up military trials for anyone accused of civil rights violations. So the Freedmen's Bureau monitors any violations, and the military will then try people who are accused of civil rights violations. The idea is you need to protect the rights of these freed people. Now, they passed this over Johnson's veto. Johnson vetoed this. He did not want the Freedmen's Bureau's powers to be expanded. He did not want military trials for Southerners or anyone accused of civil rights violations. But of course, he's a Southerner, and he's looking to protect their interests. So he vetoes it, and they pass it. And so they're looking to pass laws for inclusion. At the same time, they're looking to pass laws to expand federal power over the states. They want the federal government to restrict what states can do to their own people, to people living within the state. Should states' rights, in fact, extend to anything and everything that a state wants to do? Today, you often hear states' rights, states' rights, states' rights. But if we take that argument too far, then states would be able to do whatever they want with people within their borders, right? If we take that argument too far, states can perhaps, enslave people again. Of course, you can't because of the Constitution. But my point is, if the Constitution weren't there to protect, and the states' rights argument were pure in a sense, or so extreme that federal power was virtually non-existent or non-existent, then you're going to see states doing whatever they want with regard to your equality, your voting, your citizenship, everything. your free speech, your religion. So anyway, they're seeking to expand the federal power over the states, and they want a couple of amendments passed to do that. We're going to get to that in a moment, called the 14th Amendment, and then later the 15th, but more specifically the 14th. So we got the 13th already. They're looking to add the 14th and the 15th, the radical Republicans. We're going to talk about that shortly. Point is, Johnson is opposed to any of these greater rights. He says the end of slavery is enough. And the fact that the Southerners are going to swear allegiance to us, to the United States, that's enough. You know, this equality stuff, the citizenship stuff, this voting stuff, no, none of that. He even tells Southern states, just ignore what these guys are saying. Ignore what the radical Republicans in his own party are saying. And because of this, radical Republicans will push harder. By 1866, they take over Congress. Voters had come out in support of their vision because Johnson has angered a lot of people. People are coming to agree that change needs to happen. They'd already fought this war, and they did not anticipate Lincoln being killed and Johnson standing up and sort of putting the brakes on everything that they thought was happening, even though they might have feared it. They don't want more turmoil. So Johnson has angered a bunch of people. The radical Republicans take power, and then in 1866, both houses of Congress, because they control it, right? Both houses of Congress pass the 14th Amendment. Still needs to be ratified, but they passed the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment famously is going to do a few things. It will, first of all, recognize Black rights, right? So it's going to acknowledge citizenship of Black people. Anyone born in this country is, in fact, a U.S. citizen. All these former slaves were born in this country, therefore they are U.S. citizens. And of course, the 14th Amendment is a topic of hot debate today because people are concerned that somebody comes here pregnant or stays long enough, gets pregnant, stays long enough and has a baby here, that they're just trying to create what pejoratively, meaning in a bad way, they call anchor babies, right? And so a lot of people want to actually even Trump had talked about amending the 14th Amendment or interpreting it in a different way. He wanted the Supreme Court perhaps to come in and interpret it in such a way that it should mean that anyone who, is anyone who does this, anyone who comes here to quote unquote just have a baby will not give birth to a U.S. citizen if that child is born even on U.S. soil. But anyway, citizenship. Now, which Supreme Court case does this overturn? There was a Supreme Court case that talked about this, and now we have an amendment. Now remember, the Supreme Court says what the law of the land is. The Supreme Court says what the Constitution means. But if the Constitution specifically says something, they have to follow it. They interpret the Constitution. Therefore, if the Constitution says that these people are citizens, then that's the law. That's the only way they can interpret it. Point is, the radical Republicans, they amend the Constitution to overturn a Supreme Court case. Which one was that? We've covered it. I'll let you look for that. Another thing that the 14th Amendment does is recognizes or provides equal protection for people. Equal protection of the laws. And that just means that the law, if it treats you one way, it should treat me the other without regard to race, for example. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's basically it. So citizenship for Black folk, equal protection for Black folk, and due process for Black folk. That just means you get your day in court, right? Kind of thing. You get your day in court. The government should actually allow you process when it comes to any interaction with the government. The important ones, though, are equal protection and citizenship. Those are the ones that I want you to know. You should also know this, and that is the 14th Amendment applies to the action by states. The action by states, which means that a state must, in fact, recognize citizenship, equal protection, and due process. So they're looking, so they pass this amendment, still has to be ratified, and at the same time, they're looking to protect Black freedoms with the federal military. They placed the South under military rule in 1867, and they say, look, states in the South, you can rejoin the Union when you do a couple of things. One, ratify the 14th Amendment. It's sitting there. We passed it. Ratify it. Ratify that 14th Amendment and start holding state conventions to recognize Black men's right to vote. They want them to go beyond the 13th Amendment, which freed slaves, right? Presumably. They want them to, the southern states, to ratify the 14th Amendment, and they want states to start actually holding conventions about where they will discuss and formulate plans to allow Black men to vote. Now, Johnson, in the meantime, is opposing all this stuff, the 14th and the 15th. He was fine with the 13th. He supported it. Told states in the South to actually ratify the 13th Amendment, but this 14th and 15th, this is too much for him. And so he's pushing back and he's firing people. He's doing things to subvert what the radical Republicans want for the nation. So what do? Well, they impeach him. It's the first impeachment ever in our history. Not the last one, obviously. Trump, of course, was impeached and famously impeached twice. Lincoln, of course, I'm sorry, Clinton was impeached, right? Nixon resigned before he was actually officially impeached, although he was about to get impeached. Anyway, we only had a few of them. Interestingly, most of them have been in the last, 50 years. Not even 50 years, right? We've had 3 impeachments in the last few presidencies. Clinton 1, Trump 2. Anyway, they impeached Johnson because he had opposed their attempts at reform. They said he had given aid and comfort to the South, which, was traitorous to the United States. He is firing officials who, by firing officials in this effort to actually thwart the radical Republicans' agenda. And the claim here was that he was firing them without process. Don't worry about the specifics necessarily. What you need to know is that Johnson was impeached because he really didn't like this vision for the nation. Now, Johnson, the radical Republicans' vision. Now, Johnson is going to survive impeachment. Nobody's ever been removed, right? There's a lot of people misunderstand impeachment. Impeachment just means you are called into question. You are charged with something as a president. Doesn't mean you're necessarily removed, right? No president has ever been removed. By 1870, because he is weakened, Johnson is weakened, the radical Republicans managed to pass, okay, we already know they passed, but pass and get ratified both the 14th and 15th Amendment. Not only had they already passed the 14th, but once they impeach Johnson, they're able to pass the 15th and then get both of these ratified. The 15th Amendment. Oh, there's this impeachment thing. I forgot to post that. So this is actually a ticket to the U.S. Senate trial impeachment of Johnson, and I think he barely got away by the skin of his teeth by, I think, 1 vote. I can't remember exactly, but they weren't going to remove him. That is a very drastic step in removing a U.S. president. Although sometimes I think it should have happened. Okay, so both the 14th and the 15th Amendment, remember, are going to apply to states. What does the 15th Amendment do? The 15th Amendment recognizes Black men's right to vote, not women, just men. So now we have slavery ended. We have the 14th Amendment with all these other rights, and the 15th Amendment. You have to be allowed to vote if you want to protect all your other rights. And they both apply to states, the 14th and the 15th. This is a curb on state powers. And the reason that these actually get ratified is because a lot of people come out to vote for them, obviously, but a lot of Black people have come out to vote on them as well. Black people are voting. And of course, they pass. This was known, all of this is known as radical Reconstruction, right? It's radical, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th. These are radical, especially those last two. And it lays the basis for Black freedoms. But what we have to recognize is that it's not just that Congress, white people, were reaching out to help helpless Black folk. No, radical Reconstruction will work hand in hand with Black people's own efforts to rise, their own efforts to rise. Black people's own efforts to rise during Reconstruction is called Black Reconstruction. Black Reconstruction was something that was thought of, that was coined. It was a term coined and sort of it was a theme that was created, in a sense, by W.E.B. Du Bois. We're going to talk a lot more about him later, but W.E.B. Du Bois was a preeminent Black scholar of the late 1900s and early 20th century. I'm sorry, late 19th century, early 20th century. We're going to talk more about him later, but he's the one who talks about Black Reconstruction, where he highlights Black folks' own efforts to reconstruct their own lives, the efforts of Black people themselves. These efforts had long been denied a place in history. They had not really been recognized. We talked about Reconstruction. Historically, it's always what the radical Republicans did and what white people did. But what he did, W.B. Du Bois, was to turn it around and say, look, people did their own thing as well to reconstruct their lives. For example, after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, voting among Black men skyrockets. So they're showing agency, right? They're doing for themselves. Voting skyrockets amongst Black men. And in fact, they're holding wrong. I skipped something. Pardon me. I've actually revamped this whole section because I teach Reconstruction normally, but I've had to focus on the Black experience, and so I've changed a lot of things around. So forgive me if it's a little bit raw. The important thing, of course, is that you get the information that you need in order to be prepared for the stuff later. So just to back up a little, W.E.B. Du Bois, right, who talks about the efforts of Black folk to reconstruct the nation, is important because this theme, this idea, had long been denied. It was often misrepresented. So you would see cartoons like this one, not that one, where that would lampoon Reconstruction, that would make fun of it, that would make it seem as though all Black people wanted was to lay around and be taken care of. You could probably read this. I'm trying to read it now. The Freedmen's Bureau, as we've discussed already, we know what that is. An agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. Twice vetoed by the president and made a law by Congress. Of course, the radical Republicans. Support Congress and you support the Negro. Sustain the president and you protect the white man. Now, the president here, of course, is Johnson. So this is how a lot of white folk in the South, most of them, if not, the vast majority, they're going to see Reconstruction in this way. And in fact, they still see it this way. A lot of white people in the South see Reconstruction as an effort to put Black people above them when they didn't deserve it, because as is depicted in this cartoon, Black people are lazy, they just want to be taken care of, and so forth. So, these images have a long history, these ideas. But the reality was that after and because of Reconstruction and after the Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, you're going to see a lot of people grabbing freedom for themselves. After ratification of the 15th Amendment, in particular, voting skyrockets, and what you're going to see is Black men filling positions of power. A lot of Black men would become, for example, office holders at the state and federal level, congressmen, also at least one senator, I believe. Point is, they're holding positions of power in the federal government and at the state level as well. Government jobs, federal, state, and local jobs. For example, not just representatives and government officials, but judges and police officers and postal workers. Most of these men, and they are men who are filling positions of power, are going to be Civil War veterans. Remember, these are people largely who had struck out for freedom. A lot of them were Northerners. They were educated. You're not going to get too many of these from the South, but they had struck out for their own vision of freedom. They had contributed to the Union victory, and now they want more. They were Civil War veterans, and what's interesting is a lot of these guys, after the war is over, a lot of these veterans, by the way, they carry guns. A lot of them carry guns because they were veterans, and they say, you know what? The Second Amendment. This is interesting. Black men are amongst the first, if not the first, community of people within the country to claim that the Second Amendment gives them an individual right to bear arms. So they carry guns. We're going to get back to this point about the Second Amendment later. So what you're seeing because of radical Reconstruction is a lot of Black men rising in power, in positions of power. Things are looking better for them in this regard. But even before the war was over, Black Reconstruction had begun in the North and in the South. I mean, in all the ways that we discussed, right? We've seen Northern efforts even before the war, and during the war, we've seen Northern efforts, right, by free Black people to reconstruct their lives. Fugitives, also slaves, reconstructing their lives, right? But people from both sides serving in the Union Army, supporting the war effort. And in fact, the issue of slavery being tied to the Civil War was largely forced by people running away to the Union camps, serving in the Union Army, right? Slaves. And so this, in a sense, is part of Reconstruction as well. And it is Black Reconstruction. I'm not going to wait. I'm a slave. I'm not going to wait for you to give me something that I can take for myself. So they were doing this well before the war started and through the war. And they were doing it both at the national level and the local level. I'll just give you a couple of examples. During the war, 1864, whatever, the National Convention movement. You might remember the National Convention movement from a prior lecture. That's revived, right? So this effort to bring Black people together across the United States and to talk about Black rights and moral uplift and all this self-help, and to push for laws to recognize Black freedoms, that's all back on the books by 1864. It had kind of faded away. Point is, it's still there. It's there. Frederick Douglass is actually going to be the head of the National Convention movement, and he and others are going to push for all of this. Not just moral uplift and self-help. Don't just do for yourself. Don't just do for your community in terms of your small community, but push for laws to recognize Black freedoms, full emancipation, equality. It is these groups, headed by people like Frederick Douglass, that are talking to Lincoln toward the end of the war, saying, you need to actually end slavery. You need to give Black men the right to vote. And that's exactly what comes out of the radical Republican Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. My point here is simply this. It wasn't just Congress and white men doing for Black folk. They were fighting that fight as well, trying to convince others of the need for this to happen at the national level. It also, of course, happens at the local level, right? People are voting. Here you have, it's called the first vote, right? And so you see local ordinary guys acting. You might have heard the old saying, right? All politics is local, right? Meaning if you act locally, you can think globally in a sense, right? Your vote matters beyond yourself. And so they're doing these sorts of things. And so this, of course, is after the 15th Amendment, but they're during the war also acting at the local level, successfully challenging laws in free areas. For example, California was a free state, but California, uh, before 1863, during the war, still had a law prohibiting black people from testifying in court. It's a free state, but they had this law. And in 1863, the black community comes together and they push for California to change this law. And in 1863, that law is changed. They allow black people to testify in court. And as I said, such laws existed in southern states, but even in some northern states, but they will start falling. Another example, Illinois. Illinois had a law up until 1865, the end of the war, that required black people to pay a fine if they wanted to come into the state. This is a free state, but if you wanted to come in here as a black person, you have to pay a fine, like a fee. If you fail to pay, well, we're going to put you into forced labor to private bidders. Meaning, if you fail to pay, we're going to sell you off, basically, because people will come up and bid for your labor. It's like slavery. But by 1865, it's repealed. So you see stuff falling in the North as well. So even before the war ends, you're going to see political efforts in free areas. And in the South, you're going to see many slaves reconstructing their own humble lives. Black people are going to work to shape their own future. Again, agency. As the war is ending, and especially after the war, but as the war is ending, they're going to work to reconstitute their families. After the war, they go searching for loved ones. They go from plantation to plantation, state to state, hundreds of miles, walking, looking for people that were sold away from them, or people that they were sold away from. They go walking. They write letters with the help of people who can read, right? They write to the old plantation home that may be in ruins now, but who knows? They write to the old plantation homes. They write to churches. They write to the Union Army. They write to the Freedmen's Bureau. Have you seen this person? And give a description. Most of these, of course, fail because it's not easy to find people. It's not like today, right? You look up old high school buddies or old high school, flames and stuff on Facebook, and when how that can go sometimes and cause problems. But you can't really look people up like that at this point. And so a lot of these efforts fail. And interestingly, a lot of these efforts sometimes cause problems. I mean, how do you identify a child that was taken as a baby? Children were taken as babies. And so how do you identify a child? Scars, birthmarks, there are these ways, right? And sometimes, they were sure it was the person, and sometimes they weren't so sure, but they form a family anyway. Sometimes a husband would travel looking for a wife that he was sold away from and find that she had remarried. She had a new husband, and she's with him. Now what do you do? Well, sometimes a woman would choose, right? One woman actually, there's a story where one woman who was confronted with this dilemma, I suppose. She's married. She was married to guy number one. He got sold away. She's married to guy number two. Guy number one comes looking for her. Now she's got two guys in her life. Well, sometimes they choose. Sometimes they go back to the old one. Sometimes, it's hard to say, depending. Some choose love, some choose duty. But there's a story of one woman who actually, when she's confronted with this issue, gives a probationary period of a couple of weeks to both of them. Show me which one of you deserves me. Now, I don't mean to make light of this, but it kind of reminds me of The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, right? It's like, show me which one of you deserves me. The point is, these women had agency, right? They were deciding for themselves who was better in their lives. But again, I mean, this had to be difficult, right? Do you choose the first guy, the second guy? Do you choose love? Do you choose duty? Do you choose the guy that needs you more? Even if you love the other guy? I don't know. Of course, we're getting into all these different sorts of personal ways of looking at things, but we have to, in a sense, to try to even begin to recognize how these people had to deal with these issues. Some men actually would come across two wives, right? Or would have two wives, right? You have a wife, and your ex-wife or your former wife, or the old wife you never really divorced, comes looking for you, and you got a new wife. And what do? Some men actually support both wives because they feel it's their duty. You keep only one, right? Because usually anyway. But there's no polyamorous stuff, at least no term for it, and it wasn't something that was a thing as it is seems to be in some circles today. But the point is, some men would support both wives and stay with one because he's got love and duty. The point is, these aren't things that we ordinarily think about with the end of slavery. We think, oh, freedom, great. But there were issues. What about the support of children? Right? A lot of women will go looking for the dad with the son right next to her, right? Saying, hey, this is your child. And some guys are like, no, that's not me. It's interesting because at this time, the court dockets are bulging with legal suits, paternity suits, child custody cases, alimony, right? Meaning spousal support. And so it's interesting that Black people are jumping right into this and using the courts. They're using what is available to them. They're maneuvering through the system as best they can as they're trying to reconstitute their lives, reconstitute their families. Another way, of course, of reconstituting families or maybe building new ones is to legalize marriages. Marriages that were real to you, but which were not recognized by the state, now are going to be recognized by the state. A lot of people don't do this. They just still consider themselves married because that's the way it's always been. But a lot of people will actually get married by the church. I mean, it's not that they didn't get married by the church before, but by the church and the state, in the eyes of the state, right? By the power vested in me, by the state of Vermont, right? I hear pronounce you man, wife, whatever. A lot of these people would get married for religious reasons, right? So it's Christian, they thought. I mean, that wasn't such a huge thing back then, although it was something that some people considered. That whole Christian thing was Christian marriage thing was more of a thing later on. But anyway, whatever. So they want to be married in the eyes of God properly, religious reasons. They want the state to recognize them. They want a sense of family and identity. But they also had practical reasons, right? Because if you get married, then your children can get a legitimate claim to property of the father's property. So you marry a guy, you're with a guy, he's got some land, you want to lock him in, right? Because if you give birth to the guy's child, then that child needs to be taken care of. So you marry the guy, and the child is going to be taken care of. At least that's the presumption. That's the legal presumption. A lot of wives get married also because they know that a lot of the veterans come home, they have military pensions. You marry this guy, he's got something. So, take care of your wife and kids with your military pension. And they would have massive church weddings. And as you see here in this picture, a church wedding, you only see one bride here, but sometimes you had dozens of couples getting married at once. Remember the jumping the broom whole thing? You don't really see that. That's dying away. People are more into sort of what is considered the normal traditional wedding at this time, with massive church weddings, no brooms to jump. And so they reconstitute their families. They often live in large families, very close-knit, tight communities, forming new communities where there's a sense of social and political life. All of this sense of community that's taking shape is going to be the basis for civil rights change down the road. So what's going to happen is that they're constituting, for them the label was slave, at least legally, right? And they understood this at some level, but as horrible as it sounds, but now they have a new identity. And they're laying claim to it. They're laying claim to individuality. After the war is over, especially, but toward the end of the war, black people, slaves and former slaves, they're talking back to white people who are still trying to keep them in their place, especially the former slave owners. They're claiming their individuality. It's like, I don't have to. And now you got to remember, they can only go so far because, in fact, the structure, the way it was, there's going to be a lot of violence against black people. We will talk about that shortly. So you can take it only so far. The U.S. military isn't always there to help you. So because of that, I mean, they might talk back to white people who are trying to keep them in their place, but a lot of them just leave. Most of them just leave plantations in huge numbers. And reportedly, white slave owners are astonished by this. A lot of white slave owners had bought into this idea of the pro-slavery argument, slavery a positive good. A lot of these people genuinely feel betrayed when their slaves leave. They had bought into this paternalistic view of slavery. Paternalistic, meaning like the father taking care of children who can't care for themselves. They feel betrayed. Like, oh, I fed this person. This person was my slave, but then when she turned, old or she hurt her foot, I let her stay in that house over there and, fed her okay and everything. And now I'm betrayed. She left. Well, she was still your slave, right? When slaves leave, a lot of slave owners, they regret that they have no servants left. There's this one account that I read where a woman can't comb her own hair, and so she's upset about that because she has to comb her own hair now, and she doesn't know how to do it. Because since she was a baby, she had her hair combed for her by a black woman. Another former slaveholder cries because she had to wash her own feet. Like, I never thought I'd have to do this. I don't have any more slaves to do this for me. Now, a lot of slaves do stay on plantations. Most of them leave, but a lot of them do stay on, and a lot of them will end up working for money. And a lot of them will feel, interestingly enough, some sort of affinity, right? Some sort of closeness with the slave owner. But a lot of them, are also thinking, well, this is what I've always known, and I can stay here and be a servant and still make a little bit of money, and I don't have to take my chances out there in a world that is in turmoil, it seems. I can go out there and maybe get 3 meals a day. I can get 3 meals a day here for sure, and maybe a little money, and I'm no longer a slave. I have the choice to leave. But of course, it's going to be very difficult for a lot of people to leave in practical terms. It takes money to go search for people. A lot of them won't just leave plantations. They will leave the South. They will go north. They will go west. They're searching for jobs. They're searching for a new life. A lot of them change their names. You're going to see a lot of black people, former slaves, change their names to things like Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln. A lot of black people are named Washington and Jefferson. They take these names, of course, after the presidents during, this Reconstruction period. Others will change their names to whatever their trade was. If you're a baker, you become baker. If you're a booker, you become, meaning someone who can actually work the books, right? Like you can cipher is what they called. You can add and subtract and maybe even read and write. Booker. They take the name carpenter and so forth and so on. A lot of them make up new ones. This is where you get the name Freeman, right? A lot of black folk are surnamed Freeman. Now, some do keep the names of their owners, which later on some people will consider to be, slave names, and will change them later. But a lot of them, which of course, let me back up. A lot of people consider these slave names now, which is why they're actually changing them to the names of presidents and trades and so forth. But some of them do keep that name. It's easier that way. Yeah, they recognize that it was a slave name, so to speak, but it's easier to keep it. You're already known that way. So what's the point? I'm sure a lot of people would say that there is a point. But for others, I mean, they're making their own decisions, right? So they're reestablishing their lives. They established churches throughout the South, just like they did in the North. Now, many of these people are still steeped in the old ways, right? Many of these former slaves, they're still into the voodoo and the hoodoo, right? You have the hoodoo priest, the hoodoo priestess, hoodoo, Hoodoo. But you will see this sort of mixing with Christianity, as I've noted before, the syncretic religion, right? Syncretism. Especially in the rural backwaters of the South, you're going to see a lot of this. You don't see it as much in cities or in the North. You will see it in the rural areas, North and South, but mostly in the South. This is also where a lot of Black people are still living closely or nearby Scots-Irish people. And the Scots-Irish people that come over here, who are the ancestors of white folk in the South today, at least those who are still there generationally, these Scots-Irish people, they're very, very superstitious at the time, and even to some degree today. Now, a lot of this will sort of continue, but they're going to set up their own Christian churches where they're going to leave white churches because of their prejudice, and they're going to leave white churches so they can be self-determined. They can determine their own futures. They can have a sense of dignity and identity amongst themselves, and they're going to form their own distinct worshiping style. Shouting, clapping, stomping. Black churches are known famously for call and response. You call, I respond. So you will often see, if you've been to these services, and it happens in some Baptist white services as well, but it's really, really a cultural marker of Black churches where the preacher will say something and the congregation will speak out, and it's not like it's something that that is practiced necessarily. It's not scripted. It's just the priest says, the reverend says something, and you feel something, and you just shout out whatever it is that you're feeling, right? And so that comes from the African tradition, and you still see it today. Call and response, the shouting, the clapping, the stomping. Very lively services. Usually the Black folk who are Christians will be Baptists, and you're going to see hundreds of thousands of church members coming into these churches in the years after the Civil War, and the church will become the center of community life for these people. It will be the center of family life and the community life, the Black community. Now, we have to be careful because, when you say the Black community, we can't overstate that. But here, at least at this point in history, there is a distinct, I think a more distinct Black community in the South that is formerly enslaved. They had all been in it together. They're emerging from it together. So in churches, you will see men be the leaders, right? They're the preachers. They're the ones who are building the buildings and making furniture for sale. They're doing all these things. The men do a certain something. The women, though, are going to be the bulk of the congregation. Women are going to make up the majority of churchgoers and church members. Just like today, women make up more than men. The women make up church membership more so than men do. Women are going to be the teachers. They're going to be missionaries, the sort of social workers. These women will get a particular a particular status. They're going to be known as church mothers. These are going to be women who don't have, they're not really preachers. They're not really church leaders officially, but they lead by influence. They have a strong informal influence. In fact, when a church is thinking of bringing in a new preacher, these women will have a great influence on who that's going to be. They want a particular sort of preacher. They are very influential also in how church money is distributed. They generally want it for certain things like education of children. They generally want it for a missionary work, right? And so they're going to be instrumental in how the church delivers its services, and they're also themselves going to be what become known as informal evangelists. They're not really preachers, but they do talk the word as they see it, right? And so that is recognized. And so they're doing all these things for the church, raising money, helping choose preachers, acting as missionaries and teachers, and distributing church money and so forth, and even being informal evangelists. These churches will often raise money by making products for sale. The men will make furniture. The women will make like a lot of medicines. Men will make some medicines too, but a lot of women make medicines. And back then, we talk about medicines, a lot of it's probably like alcohol and opium and stuff like that. But they would make medicinal stuff with herbs as well, and handcrafted stuff, clothing, shoes, all of this to sell, to raise money, and maybe to donate. These churches are doing a variety of things. Remember, they become the center of Black life. They're going to also work as mutual aid societies, right? Where Black people will come together to help each other. So they're going to give out medical care, health insurance. They're going to set up orphanages for their children. They're going to set up banks for Black people to put their money in. They're going to set up labor unions for protection of workers. So churches are acting as mutual aid societies that we've discussed before. We're trying to actually uplift the Black community. They're also going to function as political entities, these churches. Among the Black people, there's a strong belief at this time that politics must be made moral through Christianity. That Christianity must be infused into politics to make it moral, because Christianity deals with equality, they say, right? WWJD, what would Jesus do? Now, it's not just them. This move among Black churchgoers is part of a strong effort among Christians generally to inject Christianity into politics, to moralize politics, which they see as very, very dirty. So they function as these political entities because they believe in this, and they believe in salvation, not just through spiritual equality, but salvation through political involvement. Salvation in the afterlife, sure, through spirituality, but salvation here through political involvement. And so they engage in things like voter registration. They engage in candidacies. Campaigns, right? Candidates' campaigns. They support them. And at the forefront of all of this, the face of the church when it comes to politics will be the preacher. They will be the liaisons, the connection, right? The links to the white community. Between the white community and white politics and the Black churches stand the preacher. And that is still the case today in a lot of cities. You will see this. In places like Cleveland and Baltimore, I know that there are very, very strong church affiliated political organizations and political churches that get involved in politics, although they have to be very, very careful because you're not really supposed to preach from the pulpit. I think it's called the Johnson Act. Not supposed to do that because you want to maintain your tax exempt status. But anyway, don't worry about that. The point is, this happens. And at least informally, you see a lot of preachers then and now have a lot of sway in local politics. Oops. These churches, of course, function in a variety of ways, not just in the manner that we talked about, but also they function as schools. Education is going to be of great importance to the emerging Black community in the South. At, you know, by the end of the war, more than 90% of the freed people, that's 9 out of 10 of these former slaves, they're illiterate when slavery ends, right? Because it was illegal to teach them how. It's remarkable, in fact, that 10% of them knew how to read, given the restrictions placed upon teaching them to read. So this is something that they see, that is the Black community sees as something that they have to attack, right? They need to turn this thing around. So they work to educate themselves and each other. They're going to educate the little ones, and they're going to educate the old ones too. In fact, there are stories of little kids sitting next to really older women reading, trying to read the same thing. They were basically at the same level in terms of reading. But they're not going to just, that is, the Black community isn't going to simply rely on churches. They're also going to set up proper schools. They set up hundreds of schools for freed people across the South. Most of them, of course, are going to be funded by Northerners. Not all, but most of them. White and Black, by the way. And many of them are going to be funded by freed people themselves who realize that the importance of education. They will bring their money together to pay teachers, to buy land, maybe a building. All of these are examples of their trying to pull themselves up. Now, they are going to be helped by the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau gives money to all the schools, whether they are funded by Northerners or funded by the freed people themselves. They're going to give money. The Freedmen's Bureau will give money for teachers and books, buildings. These schools are typically going to follow what is known as the New England curriculum, where you're going to have emphasis on the 3 R's, as they call it, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic. 3 R's as they see it. They're going to be teaching history, geography, rules of writing. Now, the result of all of this is that by about 1880, literacy has actually gone down by 20%. So it's at about 70%. And 30 years later, in the early 1900s, it's going to go down another 30%. So it's going down generation after generation. It's not only young kids who are learning, but also older folk, as I mentioned. But very, very importantly, you're going to see young men and women actually going to college. HBCUs are going to crop up. HBCUs, these are historically Black colleges and universities, as they're known today. They were known then as Black colleges, but today historically Black colleges, right? They emphasize teacher training. They emphasize religious instruction and moral uplift. And these HBCUs will form the basis of Black and middle upper, they will form the basis of middle and upper class Black society. And it's fascinating because some of these people even were children born of slaves. For example, these people here. There's a guy named Zach Hubert who was a slave. He has 12 kids, and all of them graduate from college, and a bunch of them were in college at the same time. And so this is a true miracle in the sense. I mean, this is amazing. I mean, today, I think that I did well given, my parents' upbringing. But my parents were not slaves the way slavery existed at this time. They were very poor. They were treated harshly, working in southern Texas. But they weren't slaves, right? And so I find my ability to go beyond my parents. Those of you who actually took the time to watch the intro, a lot of you I know didn't or didn't finish watching it. Yeah, I talk about my parents. My mom went to first grade. My dad went to fourth grade. They were very poor, and so we made it. But I mean, I think that's cool. But this is amazing. Think about this. This man had been officially property, and within a few decades, all of his kids have graduated college. That's amazing to me. Now, and they're going to these HBCUs, right? Historically Black colleges, universities. Now, these HBCUs, they're not all going to agree on the type of education that they should deliver to their people, right? So, on the one hand, you have a classical model where we talk about high academic standards, scholarship, intellectualism. On the other hand, you have colleges who push vocational training, working with your hands, working a skilled trade, not just digging ditches, but skilled trades. Of course, we have colleges like this today, right? Vocational training, technical colleges. And so these sorts of models always, for a long time existed in this country. And even among the Black community, there was, as there is even today, this question, oh, should I go to this kind of college or that kind of college? Now, this distinction or this sort of disagreement on what the emphasis of education should be for the Black community, and they're not just talking about personal choice. They're saying, really, on one hand, some people are saying you need to go and become an intellectual. We all do. On the other hand, people are saying, no, you need to just do for yourself and get a good trade and rise that way. This is going to create some conflict. We're going to talk about this later on when we talk about Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Point is, it's going to cause conflict within the Black community. But a deeper point is that there is a Black community and it's rising. The Black community is on the rise in the South, but this very fact will, of course, cause tremendous backlash. There's going to be lots of resistance to what you see here. And so we have to recognize that Reconstruction has its limits. Most Southern white people don't want change. Wealthy Southerners, they need a class of laborers to do their bidding, and they don't want to pay people for it. So they're really upset about how this is going for them and the fact that slavery is ending or has ended, right, as they knew it. You have the wealthy who want a stable labor source, and they want people at the bottom. You also have poor, ordinary white Southerners who embrace racial superiority. And they recognize, or at least they fear, that the new freedoms for Black people challenge their ideas of racial superiority. So most white people in the South cannot bear what they see. And they immediately resist, trying to hold down the population of Black people who are rising, like the people you see in the picture. And so we have to recognize Reconstruction has its limits. In fact, during Reconstruction, people will be denied the basic means to sustain themselves. They're going to be denied all kinds of things. Let me just give you some examples. One, very importantly, is land. Land is crucial in the Southern society. It's an agrarian society. If you don't have land, good luck. And so even before the war ended, a lot of slaves had already started claiming the lands of planters. In many cases, the very people who had claimed to own them. They just started taking it over. They started squatting on land. You might have heard of squatters' rights, right? They just squat on it. They start to work it, and they claim to it, not just because they worked it for generations as slaves, but because they are working it now as free people. Now, this idea of squatting is really something that we've always recognized in Anglo-American legal thinking. You squat on land, you use it, you have some right to it. Even today, this is the case. The point is, you use the land or you lose the land. That's kind of the thinking in Anglo-American law. In every state, every state has this doctrine called adverse possession. Don't worry, you don't have to worry about the technical whatever, but I'm just trying to get you to understand how these people would have thought of a claim and how ordinarily, if they had not been black, that claim may have been actually recognized. Because throughout our history, we think of property as being something you use. You don't just let it lay around. Every state has a law on this. It's called adverse possession. I'll give you an example. I have this backyard, and I had a chain link fence all the way around my yard. I've since put up a wooden fence, put that up myself, but it started because my neighbor on the side there, he just goes ahead and he puts up a wooden fence on his side. Nice guy. He puts it up, and he happens to put it up about 1.5 to 2 feet on his side of the fence, of the chain link fence that's already there. At some places like a foot, some places 2 feet, right? It's not exact. But the point is, what do? I went ahead and took that whole chain link fence down that was on my side now. I claimed it. So I took it down. My wife has planted stuff there. I mow it. My son mows it, weed whacks it. Well, guess what? In a number of years, the state of Texas will recognize that strip of land. It runs from the front of my yard, or right around toward the back of my house. They put it that way. Runs from the back of my house all the way to my back fence. And so that strip of land, it's about, I don't know, 60, 70 feet. It's going to be mine because I'm using it. The other guy decided to put up a fence. He has title to it, but I'm going to get use of it. The point is, this is something that is one of the reasons that we spread westward as a nation, because white settlers kept doing this. And when they see, of course, black people doing it in the South, some people are like, yeah, that's cool. They have a right to that. But a lot of Southerners are like, no. Now, they're working it by the time the war ends. And in fact, by the time the war ends, it had sort of been made official. Remember General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, right? March to the sea and all that. During the war, he had issued a Field Order 15. And basically what he's saying, and you can read it there, but basically what he was saying was like, he's recognizing the property interests of these former slaves in the land that they had worked as slaves and who are in the land that they are working now. So there's a sense, a shared sense that they had earned a right to the land. And this, again, is why we get the phrase 40 acres and a mule. They were promised 40 acres and a mule. Well, that never really happens. By the time the war is ending, they're still working that land, but we're going to see that the land eventually is going to be given back to the former slaveholders under Johnson. Lincoln might have done the same thing. He seems to have started to do this, but it is Johnson that is very, very clear. No, this land is going back to the former slaveholders. Now, some of these freed people are going to resist the forced evictions, sometimes violently with guns, but it's going to do no good. They're outnumbered, they're outgunned. The result of all of this is what people start calling a landless emancipation. Freedom without land. Landless emancipation. And in this society, again, in the South, if you don't have land, you don't have much of anything. Instead of owning land, a lot of freed people become what are known as tenants, like a landlord tenant, somebody who rents. This is exactly what happens. So much like a lot of people are tenants when they rent a house or an apartment, black men would sign contracts with the landowner to rent the land. And then he, of course, would actually plant on that land. He's not really owning the land. He's renting it if he can. And of course, he's buying supplies from the landowner, who also is the big merchant in the area. But yeah, so they're working it, but they're poor because the contract favors the landowner. High rents, high prices for supplies, food, material for clothing. So these people are just basically living hand to mouth, as they say, right? You get $1 in your hand, and before you know it, you got to eat whatever you can buy with it. Now, most of these freed people, though, won't even have money to rent. So what they will become is what are called sharecroppers. And it is what it sounds like. So tenants, they're actually paying for the rental of the land, but with money, sharecroppers, they're not really paying for it. They're not paying money for rent. They're paying, in a sense, with a share of their crop. So they're sharing their crop. Their very work actually is put into the land, and whatever they get out of it is what they give a portion of it, of course, not all of it, to the owner of the land, who's often their former enslaver. And like tenants, they get a lot of stuff from the landowner on credit: food, supplies, materials for clothing. All of this lasts very well into the 20th century, man. These sharecroppers actually have really, I mean, this is the kind of house, right? And so this is actually an early 1900s picture. This stuff lasts well into the 20th century. And tenants and sharecroppers, they're trapped in debt, high prices, often cheated by the owner, often. And what are you going to do about it? You don't have any political power in your local area. The military isn't always around to protect you. And so a lot of these tenants and sharecroppers, they really don't make a profit. In fact, there was something called counting, right? Like counting 1, 2, 3. So counting day. On counting day, that's when they were supposed to have a tally of what they owed to the owner. And very often, what they're seeing is that their debt is just getting higher and higher and higher. They're trapped in sort of this circle of debt. And the problem with this is obvious, but it's even worse than the obvious, because if you get into debt and there's going to be a point where they say, you know what, you probably can't pay, they might actually keep you locked into that, or they might just say, you know what, you're going to go to jail. I want my money now, and if you can't pay me now, I'm going to call the sheriff. And that's exactly what happens. What happens is that debt can lead to jail, because they used to have debtor's prison. So what arises out of this whole landlessness and the fact that they can't do for themselves and the fact that they get stuck in debt is a rise in the prison population. And in fact, something called convict leasing. Convict leasing has long roots. Convicts for a very long time have been used to do work, for example, in the village or the town or wherever. No different here. Into the 20th century, in fact, it lasts, where convicts are rented out by the state to private companies, and these private companies have contracts with the government in order to build public works projects. So just flesh that out a little bit, right? So you're in jail, right, for something that you maybe didn't do or some minor offense, and you're going to be forced to work. And you're going to be working on building roads and so forth like that for a private company that is actually paying to rent you. And that private company has a contract with the state to build that road. So all these hands are going into it, right? I mean, you're just a pawn. And in fact, states are going to convict, states and local governments, they convict countless black men on trumped up charges, minor crimes, or no crime at all, because the black codes allow for this. Remember, you can go to jail for debt. You can go to jail for breaking a work contract under the black codes. And then the 13th Amendment comes in and says, if you have been convicted of certain crimes, then you can actually be forced to work. This is slavery by another name. So states are making money, and they're using black men to build the infrastructure, roads and especially. And they're keeping the black population from rising. And this slavery by another name lasts well into the 20th century. And the punishment for these people who, when they're in prison, is horrendous. I mentioned this before. As a black person in the South, you have to work in farming, and if you don't, then if you're working on anything else, you're working. If you do anything other than farming, you have to pay a special tax. So it's costly. This, of course, is designed to keep black people on the farms and working for everybody else. They don't want them working on their own. So they tax them. And even when they are able to sort of to pay that tax, and if they want to do something other than agricultural work, they're going to be poorly paid, less than the guy down the road who's not black, right? They're going to be working long hours and punished. Sometimes they're whipped for breaking a contract and then sent to jail. As I said, all of this is permitted under the black codes. And all of this is going to be pushed by Southerners called redeemers. Redeemers, people who try to redeem the South, are going to stage a counter-revolution. Really, what we're talking about here, guys, white supremacists. They call themselves redeemers because for them, they're going to redeem themselves and their place in Southern society. Political power, economic power, and physical force, and of course, social standing. So here you see as a picture by a guy named Thomas Nast, right? And he was a political cartoonist, and he was always lampooning the South. And here you have on the left, you have the Irishmen. That's Irishmen. Look how he's depicted. Irish people were almost always depicted this way, almost animalistic. In the middle, you have the Confederate States of America. I think that's Nathan Bedford Forrest, whatever, but CSA is on his buckle. And on the right, you have a Northern banker. So the idea is that you need to bring all of these together to redeem the South. You need to pull poor white people, Irish, into the Democratic Party. And they were pulling a lot of them because a lot of them actually were very, very racist, and they did not want to compete with the free black people. So a lot of Irish people are flowing into the Democratic Party. And then, of course, you have at the center the Confederate States of America. And then on the right, you have people who want to invest in the South. So altogether, they want to redeem the South. And this means gaining political power for white Southerners. Too many black people are voting. It also means gaining economic power for white people in the South. Too many black people rising. It also means regaining social standing of white people in the South because too many black people are thinking of themselves as equal as they see it. The Redeemers are going to be the heart of the Democratic Party, the all-white Democratic Party. And again, I mentioned this before, but I think it's worth saying at this moment. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party of this time period, they're not the same ones as today. They will switch platforms later on. We will talk more about that. A lot of my students often stop and be like, wait a minute, they don't sound like Democrats, and those guys don't sound like Republicans. Either one sounds like the other, right? Okay, so we'll talk about that later. So by 1870, the Redeemers are already gaining political ground. They're managing to regain Southern strength in Southern politics. They're beginning already by 1870 to remove black politicians from office. Remember all those guys who were actually winning seats in office? Well, they're rallying. The Democrats are rallying voters against them. And one of the things that they're doing is using a relatively new term called miscegenation. This term miscegenation was coined during the Civil War. And all it means is race mixing. I mean, you might have heard of this term. Today, it doesn't have, well, it still has a negative connotation for some people, but a lot of people don't realize that it actually came out of the Civil War. You still hear it in some older movies and about race relations and so forth. And you know, KKK people talk about miscegenation. They don't like miscegenation. They'll still talk about that today. Excuse me. I wish I had a cough button. I always have to turn off my mic. So this term is being thrown out there to inflame the passions of people, especially white men who don't like the idea of a black man kissing on any white woman. Worse, their sister, right? Worse, their wife or girlfriend or the girl they like, right? And so what's happening is that they're really, really pushing on the race issue. And they're bringing a lot of people, white people, into the Democratic Party, even some Northerners who are white who fear this. And so that's how they're actually winning a lot of power back in the South. So this race issue is going to heat things up. They're going to be telling white people that they're going to be losing their proper place in society. Now, this, I don't know if you've heard this. I listen to a lot of conservative talk radio. Almost every day I listen to talk radio, conservative talk radio. I like to get information from all kinds of sides and see what people are saying and, make up my own mind kind of thing. But what you hear a lot today on conservative talk radio is that black people, brown people, transgender, gay people, all these different people who are not straight white males, they will say, oh, all they want is to engage in identity politics, right? Identity politics, right? The idea that you are as a certain group of person. Maybe you're a woman. You could be a straight woman, right? You could be a black man. You consider yourself part of a group of people who are like yourself, and that's your identity, and therefore you will engage in politics that reflects and furthers your place in society. And so that's what a lot of conservative talk radio people say today about what's going on today. But what they don't recognize is that this has been going on for a very long time. This is what you're looking at here on the screen is identity politics. The fear of the loss of your place in society. And so they're gaining ground politically, and because the Democrats are gaining ground politically, they're making efforts to remove, and they are removing, programs that are designed to help black people in the South. So they're cutting taxes because they say taxes are going to be used by the federal government to actually help black people. So they start cutting taxes. They start cutting government budgets. So they don't want that. Not only are they cutting the money that's coming in to the state, they're cutting money that would otherwise be paid out for certain programs. Now, I hate to beat this up, but some of you are recognizing this already, if not all of you, and that is that this sounds like the Republican Party of today. Cutting tax, and what I need you to hone in on at this moment is cutting taxes, cutting government budgets. That is part and parcel of the Republican Party's platform today. And so we're starting to see connections here. These redeemers are going to be supported by a violent arm, a violent arm that is going to engage in unspeakable racial violence. Racial violence will become a daily occurrence. As the war was ending, and by 1870, it's going to increase dramatically. And this racial violence comes in several forms: the killing of black people on sight, lynchings, attacking, burning homes, churches, schools. They would just attack people because they're black. Now, this sounds horrible, but I'll say it. These people no longer are property, so they have no one to protect them anymore. When they were slaves, they were considered property. A white man who killed a black person would very likely be killing somebody's property and therefore would be liable for it. Now, nobody has a property interest in that person, and therefore they're free, and therefore they're targets. So there's a cruel irony there, a nasty, nasty irony. What, of course, happens is the rise of a reign of terror in the South, where night riders, and they call them night riders because they ride at night, often hooded, these people will go through the South engaging in these sorts of attacks on people, killing black people on sight, lynching them, attacking, burning these buildings. The most famous night riders, of course, are the KKK. There's also one called the 76 Association. 76. What's the reference there? 1776. So what are they saying? What's the meaning of their association? that what they're saying is that they're still fighting a revolution. For them, freedom wasn't yet achieved. And they attack Black people on sight. So we know that in their minds, at least, the spirit of 76, the American Revolution, right, the Declaration of Independence, does not include Black people. Black people in their minds are, quote, not American. You have people, organizations like the White Brotherhood, the White League. But of course, we know the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan being the most famous. Now, interestingly, groups like this are on the rise today. I think a lot of you know that. And if you trace the trajectory of membership, the number of members in groups and the number of different types of groups, you will see that there's been a rise since about 2008. What happened in 2008? Obama. Hate groups started to rise in number and in recruitment numbers. Membership, I mean. And then after 2015, what happened then? Well, you have another surge in these numbers. Why? Well, whether you like Trump or not, these men, well, mostly men, but a lot of women, believed that Trump would champion their efforts. Whatever you think about what Trump thought about this doesn't matter. What matters is that these people thought that he would be their champion. And so they rise in number. White supremacists are today recruiting lots of young men, usually, poor young men, lots of them out of the military, a lot of young men who maybe feel like outsiders, maybe haven't been able to find their place, maybe they're out of a job, they need something to hold on to, they need some sort of sense of identity. And these men offer that to them. These organizations offer that kind of stuff to them. And so it's important to recognize the allure of such a thing. We can all, I think, recognize that in some time or another, we felt like an outsider, like we wanted to belong to something, and we weren't sure and we wanted some sort of identity, or at least somebody to recognize our identity and who we were. And you know what? This is what's happening. This is not justification by any means, right? This is something that if we don't try to understand it, it can get away from us if it hasn't already. I mean, you saw what happened on January 6th at the Capitol, okay? Say what you say, think what you think. There were a lot of these guys there. So during Reconstruction, these groups are attacking people on site. But it's interesting because these people actually targeted a certain group of people first. Who are they going to target? They're not going to just target any old guy. They're going to target people who have risen. They're going to target the educated. They're going to target people who vote, somebody who holds some office or a good government job or any good job, landowners, business owners. They target these Black people first. So you're going to see beatings and killings and rapings of women also. That stuff is going to become common in the South. Now, they're going to also kill some white people too, because there's white people in the South who also don't like what they see with the violence against Black folk. You will have white people in the South who maybe just didn't say anything, but they didn't approve of slavery or didn't want to live near slaves, and they wanted, in fact, a peaceful society for themselves, or maybe they sympathized with Black people. The point is, these people were lynched as well. Not nearly as many Black people, for sure, but some of them. So these night riders are going to be a problem. Got some pictures there for you. Now, the federal government, under Ulysses S. Grant, is going to try to stop this. It's going to pass some acts. These are called the Enforcement Acts, and they are going to be passed, and these are statutes, meaning they're passed by Congress, right? And what they're going to do is they're going to be set out to enforce the Reconstruction amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, particularly 14th and 15th. So it's to enforce those. There's going to be a series of acts. And I don't care if you know first, second, third, but you kind of know what they do, right? So for example, the first one prohibits discrimination in voting. The second one permits federal oversight of state elections. So notice these, of course, are designed to get at the right to vote, right? The third one is interesting because it ends up being called the Ku Klux Klan Act, the KKK Act. And this is specifically to target hate groups. So just for example, it says a lot of things, but just for example, the KKK Act says that it is illegal for two or more people to ride in disguise together. So if you're riding in disguise or you're moving in disguise together, not just riding, but moving in disguise, two or more, then that's going to be a problem. They'll break you up. And if you engage in civil rights violations, there's going to be some punishment for that. The KKK Act also, interestingly, allows, this is Congress saying this, Congress handing its power to the president to suspend habeas corpus. You remember Lincoln did this. Well, the president, and at this time it was Grant, would have the power to suspend habeas corpus, round up these KKK guys, and throw them in jail without a trial. All of this, of course, can be enforced by the U.S. military. So again, don't worry if I say, what's the KKK Act and you talk about voting, whatever. I'm not going to ask you something like that. Know what the KKK Act is generally, what these acts are generally. Okay. But, they're targeting voting. They're targeting civil rights. And in a sense, some people would argue taking away liberties, because suspending habeas corpus in the South is something that they're going to point to later on and say, look, the North was tyrannical. Look what they did. They used their military to enforce these laws. Now, despite these enforcement acts, they're going to face, the nation is going to face fierce opposition in its efforts to change the South. Despite these new laws, there's going to be individual acts of violence increasing, getting more bloody over time, and several massacres are going to happen as well. Several massacres will shake the confidence of Black people and send the message to the white folks that this isn't over. I'll give you some example, well, at least one example. In 1872, there's a sheriff's election in Louisiana. It's between Republicans and Democrats. The sheriff's election is going to be contested, right? They both claim to win. The Republican candidate, because it is the Republicans who are in power and they're afraid to lose, right, to the Democrats who want to maintain power, the Republican candidate forms a militia of all Black men, arms them. They take the courthouse because they want to keep the power in Republican hands. Now, the courthouse at this time, that was sort of the center of political power. That's where all this stuff happens. So they take the courthouse, this Black militia, for a Republican candidate who was a white man. The Democratic candidate, also a white man, he assembles a mob of white men and they attack the courthouse with cannons and rifles. The Black men who are under siege, they can't withstand the onslaught. They're outnumbered. They're outgunned. And about 200 or so Black men are killed. Even the dozens who surrender, more than 200 are killed. Even the dozens who surrender are killed. This is going to be known as the Colfax Massacre. Now, here you see, interestingly, Colfax riot. I would not call this a riot. This is a massacre. And this massacre sends shockwaves through the nation. It's going to lead to a Supreme Court case, interestingly, where Black men are going to argue that they have the right to bear arms. And this is going to be the very first Supreme Court case in which it is argued that you have the right as an individual to bear arms. Now, interestingly, the Supreme Court says, no, you don't. The Supreme Court says that a state can take away your guns whenever it wants to. Oh, how things change, right? So, excuse me. This Supreme Court case is interesting to me. We'll talk more about gun rights and stuff down the road. The point here about this massacre is not just that that it leads to this case, right, where black men argue for the right to bear arms because they feel that they need to protect themselves from white violence, but also because it shows that white violence is continuing. Other massacres, in fact, will follow. Eventually, the federal government is going to just give up in the face of all this opposition in the South. And so Southern Redeemers, they're taking power back. They're overseeing the rollback of black freedoms. These Democrats are claiming that Republicans are to blame for the violence in the South. They say it is because of you, because of the changes that you have sought to make, that this violence is rising. You're meddling. You're getting in our business. And then they say, well, the violence is exaggerated anyway. I can just hear them say fake news, right? They say the violence is exaggerated. It's really not that bad. But it's horrendous, people. It's horrendous. So they're claiming that it's the fault of the Democrats, the Republicans. They're claiming that the violence is fake news, so to speak, that it's really exaggerated. And they're also saying, anyway, the Night Riders, the KKK, all these guys are fighting for their rights. So they're blaming, really, Northerners for all this violence. And they're blaming the North for the South's economic problems as well. You have to remember, slaves were the bedrock of the economy. They're gone now. So the economy's in shambles. And then they say, and on top of that, Reconstruction is costly. It costs a lot of money. And it's really just a way for Northerners to come down into the South, get in our business, and make money. They point to the Freedmen's Bureau, right? The Freedmen's Bureau is poorly run. So they say, you're just throwing money at the issue. It could have been poorly. It was kind of poorly run, but they're pointing at it and say, look, you're throwing money at the issue, and a lot of people who work through this program are coming down to the South, and they're meddlers, and they just want to make money, and they start calling them carpetbaggers because of the suitcase that were issued by the government had this sort of carpety feeling or feel to it. Now, these carpetbaggers were both black and white, and a lot of them were going into the South, and they were helping people in the many ways that we talked about that the Freedmen's Bureau helped people, right? Food, medicine, education, so forth, protecting the rights of black people. Also, of course, feeding and protecting the rights of a lot of white people. So they're saying these carpetbaggers are just trying to make money off of this. And then they say, look at these scalawags. And by the way, scalawags are not, they're kind of like carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers are Northerners who work through the Freedmen's Bureau in the effort largely to protect black freedoms. Scalawags are Southerners who actually are doing the same thing. They get jobs with the Freedmen's Bureau for the same purpose. And some of these are black and some of these are white. From the Southern point of view, carpetbaggers are bad enough. Scalawags are worse because you're a scalawag. It's kind of a nasty name, right? Scalawag, right? So you're a scalawag because you are a Southerner. You are a traitor to your people. You can imagine who these scalawags, such as they were called, might have been. These were people who had lived in the South and who for a long time maybe earnestly did not really believe in slavery, but just kept quiet. Also could be that people really just saw an opportunity to make some money through the federal government. That happens too. There is some truth in what the South is saying in terms of the Freedmen's Bureau. It could have been run better. Some people did just want to make money off the system and didn't really care about the plight of black people, which is, so what? If you're doing the job, you're doing the job. But this is something that the Southerners claimed. truth is, most of these people, scalawags, if you want to call them that, carpetbaggers too, right? That most of them really wanted to help, especially the teachers that came to the South. The thing is that the Freedmen's Bureau suffered from resistance from lots of sides. It was constantly being attacked. It finally does fail. And when it fails, people say, see, it was a failure. Well, it's interesting because all these efforts by the Democrats were to make it fail. Then it failed, and then they called it a failure. It reminds me of something. And I expect you guys will fact check these things if you have questions or concerns. But I'm going to make an analogy to something, and that's Obamacare. It reminds me of the Freedmen's Bureau. And a little bit, for this reason. Obamacare, as you know, right? Healthcare, health insurance, is a program that from the very beginning has been attacked by Republicans. And I'm saying Republicans because it was the Democrats who pushed it under Obama, right? So attacked by Republicans. And in every state they have that are red states, every red state has worked, almost every red state. Let me be careful with that. There are very powerful red states, Texas, for example, and others who have worked to actually undermine it at every turn. The federal government had actually offered federal money to states and for them to actually use this money for Obamacare in their states. But these states actually denied it. They say, we don't want this money. They even went to court to say, we don't want this money. You can't force us to take it. And they win. And then what happens in places like Texas, because Texas is at the forefront of this whole fight, what happens in places like Texas is that Obamacare isn't all that robust. And it has to do with this, well, this and others, but this example of how they try to kill it. And they're still trying to kill it. And when they kill it and it dies, if that happens, they're going to say, see, it was always doomed to fail. That's kind of what happens with the Freedmen's Bureau. They're going to, say similar things, right? Like they do with the Freedmen's Bureau. They said it was a failure, that it was a waste of money, and so forth. They're going to say that if Obamacare fails. Whatever you think about Obamacare, look this stuff up if you're curious. It's there. So we have slavery gone, the bedrock of the Southern economy gone. We have Reconstruction being very, very costly, right? And a way for Northerners, say the Southerners, to get rich. And so the Southern economies hit hard. And then in 1873, since 1873, things are getting worse because of the Depression. The Depression of 1873, we've had various depressions in our history. The Great Depression of the 1930s is not the only one. It was just the biggest. The Depression of 1873 has made a lot of things worse. The South is crushed by inflation and poverty and state debt. This is going to make it easier for Southerners to begin to say that the war was caused by the North's desire to destroy the Southern way of life and economy. They got what they wanted, but that's not really what the North was looking for. But Southerners will say that. The war was really just a way for the North to destroy us. But the 1873 Depression hits the entire country. It hits Northern industry and manufacturing, and it hits it really hard. And in fact, interestingly enough, that same depression that they're getting blamed for is going to lead the North to focus its attentions away from the South. The push for a stronger national economy is going to become a central concern for Northerners in the 1870s. And they're going to want the federal government to turn its attention that way. They want a push in industrialization. They want a push in Western settlement. They have what they call out there now the Indian problem. They want the West to take troops out of the South and deal with the quote-unquote Indian problem out West. So a lot of Northerners are thinking, maybe it's time to take our attention away from the South. Industrialization, settlement of the West. And of course, the 1873 Depression is sharpening all of this as the economy is falling. As the economy falls, the Northern fervor for social change is dying out. By the mid-1870s, it's dying out. The Depression hits in 73, and within a couple of years, people are like, okay, enough. And also, by mid-1870s, champions of equality in the Republican Party, these radical Republicans, they're now dead. A lot of the radical Republicans have been replaced by more moderate people. I'll give you an example. Charles Sumner. Remember Charles Sumner? He's the guy that got caned over the whole Kansas thing. He's dead now. It's been a few years, right, since that happened. So he's dead, and other radical Republicans are dead. So you don't have that same spirit of change and equality that is, that characterized the Republicans during the Civil War. So a lot of people in the North, including a lot of Republicans, are starting to feel maybe what could be done has already been done in the South. White Southerners, they're opposing us. They won't stop. Also, reforming the South is costing us a lot of money. It costs us a lot of money to keep troops down there, and the Southern opposition, white opposition, is just too much. This Negro problem, as they call it, just like they say Indian problem, this Negro problem, quote unquote, is insoluble. You can't solve it. Let's move on. The nation perhaps should turn to other goals, the economy, industrializing the West, and so forth. And by the way, by the mid-1870s, Republicans are realizing they don't need the black votes that much anymore. The party is spreading westward and gaining a lot of voters over there, a lot of members. So they're thinking, we don't really need black votes to win anymore. So the Republican Party begins to turn its attention away from the plight of free black people in the South. Southerners are meanwhile continuing their violence. They see their chance to get the North off of their backs. They're looking for that chance, and they talk about states' rights more and more. And the election of 1876 will give them the opportunity to get them off their backs and to push their states' rights agenda. By 1876, white people had, Democrats had regained control of Southern politics. And then there's an election for the presidency in 1876. This election of 1876 is going to lead to is really going to lead to the end of Reconstruction. In this election of 1876, you have Republicans, that is the Northerners, fielding a guy named Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, for president. Then you had the Democrats, the Southerners, fielding a guy named Samuel Tilden. Now, there's a lot of voting irregularities. There's many claims of fraud, lots of claims of intimidation of black men. I'm sure they were true. And here's the point. Each side claims victory. And they're close to war. Tilden, you see his name there, Tilden or Blood. Southerners want Tilden to be the president. Each side is claiming victory. They're thinking, we won. No, we won. They're close to war, and they're like, well, we just fought a war. What do we do? So, what do you think they do? What have they done all along since the time of the Constitution? They forge a compromise. The Compromise of 1877. The Compromise of 1877 goes like this, and it has everything to do, again, with the election of 1876. The South agrees that the Northerners, the Republicans, can take your presidency. Hayes is president. Fine. Hayes is president, and we will agree to abide the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. So the South agrees to this. So the Northerners get the presidency, and they get a promise from the South to abide the Reconstruction Amendments. The North agrees to remove all the remaining troops in the South. All of the federal troops that were there protecting the rights of black folk are agreed to be removed. And the North also promises to the South that they will not meddle in Southern politics anymore. The result of this, of course, is that the South is going to go back to its old ways. It's going to claim states' rights to do whatever it wants with people within their borders. They're going to work to overturn Reconstruction with its ideas of equality and voting rights. And of course, it's going to be supported by racialized violence. We're going to talk more about this later. But here's the thing, the North, for all its talk about rights, pretty much, turns its back on the black people of the South. It makes peace with with white Southerners, gives up on black people, and the effects will last well into the 20th century, maybe even now. So what is the significance of Reconstruction? Here you see, two guys, shaking hands. It's like they see it as being over, but for black folk in the South and in other parts of the country, it's not. A lot of Southerners will look back with a lot of regret. And so fair enough, for a lot of Southerners, it doesn't seem like it's over either. They're going to look at this as a dark time in their history. They don't look at this as the Civil War. They still call it the war between the states, or the war of northern aggression. So they look back at Reconstruction as a dark time, as a time where the North imposed itself on them. Of course, they also will fear what's in store for them. As Reconstruction is ending, they're hoping for more. They're hoping to do away with equality, miscegenation. As part of all of this thinking, they craft what's known as the lost cause narrative, which is really a term that was popularized by a Southerner who writes this book, as you can see there. And the idea begins to spread that the South lost. It was a lost cause for the South. The South lost because of its relative weakness. It didn't have enough population. Remember, it was grossly outnumbered by the North. It didn't have enough manufacturing, and this was a relative weakness. And on top of that, and more so, it was the overwhelming brutality of the North, the tyrannical North, that changed everything for them. These ideas of the lost cause, like, there's no way we could win, begin to blend with the ideas of the loss of Southern honor and pride, Southern culture, the old South. There's a restaurant down about a mile or so down the road from me called Old South. So you see a lot of stuff like that here in Texas. So this idea of a lost cause blending with ideas, also the loss of Southern honor, pride, culture, and these people are going to work to restore all of that. I mean, they're calling the war of northern aggression, more and more. They're honoring Southern war heroes, starting to put up statues, for example. Most of this doesn't really happen until later, but they start talking about honoring war heroes. They're saying also, as part of this lost cause narrative, slavery wasn't so bad. It wasn't as brutal as you say it was. Slaves were taken care of, right? They were given 3 meals a day and given a place to sleep, and given, they've really bought into this whole idea, perhaps, of the pro-slavery argument. They even say slaves were happy. I mean, they used to sing in the fields as they toiled in the southern sun. So they were happy. So they're just recasting everything, right? They're rationalizing everything. And they're saying slavery was not all that bad. And they say, it doesn't really matter because the war was never about slavery. The war was about states' rights. So they're starting to recast the narrative. They're recasting the Civil War. They're recasting Reconstruction. They say Reconstruction was full of violence, but that violence was the fault of radical Republicans wanting change, right? These outside agitators. It's interesting how many mirror images we have today as with this lost cause narrative and the fears of change during the Reconstruction. You have a lot of similar narratives. Just for example, this term outside agitators is often used, right? Whenever there's like a police shooting of a black man, and then there is a mob or a riot, a lot of people go on there and say, oh, these aren't our black people. These are outside agitators coming in. So there's this sort of motif there, right? A theme. So they're saying the violence was the fault of radical Republicans wanting change. They're coming in and trying to make us change. Never mind the Night Riders, the KKK, the White League, the White Brotherhood, right? Never mind that. But they're working to recast Construction as not so violent, and anyway, the violence being the fault of someone else. And they say Reconstruction was a waste of money. It was a waste of time. And they say Reconstruction gave black men power, and they ruined our state. They mismanaged government. They mismanaged money. They kept white people from voting. Now, all of this is BS, to put it lightly. Everything shows that the violence, of course, was cruel, and that it was caused by white Southerners who feared change and brutalized anyone who represented change. The evidence also shows that black public officials worked very capably. And it shows that white people were kept from voting, not just because they were white, but because they refused to swear allegiance to the United States. Until they did that, they were not allowed to vote. That is true. But it wasn't just because they were white. In fact, my wife, who lived in Atlanta for years, my son was born there, lived in Atlanta for years. She still believed this when she came from Atlanta. That she said, they kept white people from voting because they wanted to take over everything. And I said, babe, let's look at this, right? Because it was not just because they were white. It was because they refused to swear allegiance. They refused to accept Reconstruction. So they're crafting this whole lost cause narrative. And fascinatingly, Southern white women will be at the forefront of this narrative. They're going to be pushing it. As women and mothers, they're going to have a strong influence on future generations. They form organizations such as the Daughters of the Confederacy. Now, the Daughters of the Confederacy, they're still around. They're going to work, and they're still working, to have that lost cause narrative included in U.S. history textbooks across the country. They're pretty successful at it as well in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and even today. This is why so many people believe the South fought for states' rights, not slavery, especially in the South, like Texas. I remember I had to take my U.S. immigration test, my U.S. naturalization test, right? And they give you 100. They have 100 questions to choose from, and one of those questions is, what was the cause of the Civil War? And among the answers is slavery, and another answer is states' rights. But that's not right. It is in some very reductive form, meaning simplistic, right? But it's not really, when you think about it. To be sure, the North did not start the war, or did not fight the war, did not begin to fight the war to end slavery, but the South actually seceded, causing the war because they wanted to protect slavery. So these women who are at the forefront, right, the Daughters of Confederacy at the time, they're reacting to the reality around them. The ground is shifting beneath them. Their men are coming home from war broken. Their families are torn apart, and they fear losing their social place above black folk. That's not to say they're justified. It is to say that people who have long felt empowered and superior will fear the loss of that. If you are above someone and you are brought down to their level, or they are brought up to your level, that's not oppression. That's equality, right? But it feels like oppression because it feels like you have lost that distance between them and you. That's what's happening here. So this is really what it means for the South. And for a lot of Southerners today, they believe in this stuff. A lot of my students, most of them don't really, but their parents do. Their grandparents especially. The older generations, right, do. So what does it mean for them? That's lost cause thing. What does Reconstruction mean for believers in freedom and equality, the way we hope for it? a lot of people will say, well, Reconstruction in that sense, because Reconstruction was about comprehensive freedom, comprehensive reform of freedoms and equality. A lot of people will say, well, it was a failure. Yeah, the Union was brought together. Yeah, the slaves were freed. But look what happens right away. It was killed, really. I wouldn't say it was a failure. I would say it was killed. It was killed by Southern intransigence, right? Meaning the Southern desire to, or the Southern pushback, Southern resistance, and Northern indifference. What does Reconstruction mean for Black people? Well, slavery by another name. But still, we have to recognize that Reconstruction lays the basis for future change, for greater inclusion. During Reconstruction, Black people showed their ability to participate as equals in politics and life. Now, of course, true reform will have to wait. At this point in our history, the war has ended, and we're moving toward the 1900s. And at this point in history, knowing what I just told you, the question is, are Black people Americans, quote unquote? At this point in our history, do Black lives matter? Did emancipation mean anything? I think it did. We're going to talk more about this later. But for now, I will leave it there. Thank you for your attention and your time. Be well, be good.